please take my puppy.
I cannot let this puppy stay, not if you do not stay too.
The road to Raven's Hollow estate lay drowned in mist, the kind that crept low and clung to hems and ankles, as though the land itself wished to detain those who passed. Winter had sharpened every sound. The crunch of gravel beneath worn boots, the distant cry of a crow, the soft, uneven breathing of a small dog cradled beneath a threadbare cloak. By the time the iron gates emerged from the fog, black and immense as a judgment, the woman had already rehearsed her plea a dozen times, and discarded it each time as too much, too forward, too shameful for a lady who had once known better days. She paused there, just beyond the lantern's reach, where the light from the great house fell weak and uncertain. Once she would have been announced, her name spoken clearly by a footman, her gloves fresh, her posture unquestioned. Now she stood alone, widowed and reduced, her presence an intrusion upon an ordered world that had long ago closed its doors to women who fell without spectacle or sin, but simply by misfortune. In Regency England, such women were not cast out with violence. They were erased with politeness. Behind the gates, Raven's Hollow rose from the winter earth, all stone and symmetry, a monument to inheritance and restraint. It belonged to the Duke of Raven's Hollow, a man spoken of in careful tones, respected, distant, unyielding in matters of duty. He was said to keep his house as he kept his life, orderly, unadorned, untouched by scandal. The woman knew this, as she knew all the rules she was about to break merely by standing here. The dog stirred, a soft whimper escaping its throat. She tightened her hold, feeling the small, living warmth beneath her cloak, and something within her resolved. Pride had already cost her too much. Reputation had not fed her, nor warmed her through the long nights when grief and cold shared her bed. But the dog, faithful, foolish creature, had followed her through every loss, asking nothing but her presence in return. She could not let him suffer for the sins of a society that no longer had use for her. The bell was cold beneath her fingers. Its sound echoed louder than she expected, ringing through the mist like a confession. Time stretched. Somewhere within the house, footsteps approached, measured, unhurried. The door opened, and with it came warmth, light, and the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The Duke did not wear grandeur upon his face, only composure. His coat was dark, his cravat perfectly tied, his expression one of polite inquiry rather than surprise. He looked at her as one looks at an unexpected letter, curious, cautious, undecided. She curtsied, imperfectly, aware of every flaw, the damp hem, the faded gloves, the tremor she could not entirely still. Words pressed against her throat, urgent and unwelcome. She swallowed them back and shifted the cloak, just enough to reveal the dog's small, earnest face. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady by effort alone, "I beg your pardon for the hour." He inclined his head, neither encouraging nor dismissive. His gaze moved from her face to the dog, then back again, sharper now, more attentive. He noticed what others might have missed, the careful way she stood, as though refusing to take more space than permitted, the restraint in her eyes, holding back both fear and hope. "I would not trouble you," she continued quickly, sensing the danger of silence. "I ask only this." She lowered herself, placing the dog gently upon the stone step between them, an offering laid where dignity ended. "Please take my puppy." The words seemed to hang in the cold air, absurd in their simplicity. Not coin, not shelter, not mercy, only this small life, entrusted without promise of return. Her hands lingered for a heartbeat, then withdrew, curling into fists at her sides. She did not look up as she finished. He is well trained, loyal. He will not be a burden. The Duke did not answer at once. He looked down at the dog, who wagged his tail with indiscriminate optimism, then back at the woman whose chin was lifted too high, whose eyes refused to beg though everything else had already been surrendered. In that pause lay centuries of custom and caution, the invisible laws that governed who might be helped and at what cost. At last he spoke, not to the dog, but to her. "You have walked far," he observed. "Yes," she said. It was all she allowed herself. "You are alone." I am accustomed to it. Something shifted then, subtle as the turning of a key. He saw what she had not named, that she had chosen the lesser humiliation, offering up her companion, so that she herself might vanish, without imposing. It was the choice of a woman trained to endure quietly, to minimize her needs until they were nearly invisible. The Duke stepped aside, opening the door wider. Warmth spilled out, brushing her frozen hands, her guarded heart. "The dog may come in," he said, his tone even. Then, lowering his voice so that the words belonged only to them, he added, "You stay too." She looked up at him then, truly looked, and for the first time that night, the mist did not feel quite so heavy. She remained at Raven's Hollow, by a courtesy so delicately framed it felt almost unreal, as though the house itself had agreed to suspend judgment for a time. The Duke ordered no announcement, offered no explanations. A room was prepared overlooking the East Gardens, modest by ducal standards but warm, with a small hearth that crackled faithfully through the night. The dog was given a bowl and a place near the fire, and these quiet decisions, made without ceremony, settled upon her with a weight heavier than charity. By morning, the estate had noticed. Servants were trained to discretion, yet even restraint carries sound. Glances followed her along the corridors. Murmurs pooled and receded like tide water. She felt them without seeing them, each whisper a reminder that her presence was provisional, balanced upon the Duke's continued tolerance. She moved carefully, speaking only when spoken to, determined that no accusation of impropriety might find purchase. The Duke observed her from a distance at first, as though wary of disturbing a fragile arrangement. At breakfast he acknowledged her with formal politeness, inquiring after her comfort, the weather, the condition of the roads. His voice was calm, his posture exact, yet when she thanked him, he listened as if the words mattered, as if gratitude were not a habit but a truth. That attentiveness unsettled her more than indifference would have done. Days passed in a measured rhythm. Winter pressed against the windows, but within the house order prevailed. She was invited to walk the gardens at midday, when the sun briefly lifted the frost from the hedges. Once, she found a pair of gloves laid upon a table in the morning room, neatly folded, finer than her own yet unremarkable enough to avoid notice. No note accompanied them. She understood the gesture precisely. Aid without spectacle, kindness without claim. The dog flourished. He followed her through the grounds, earning smiles even from those who would not offer her one. She watched him with a mingling of relief and sorrow, aware that he belonged more easily than she ever could. When the Duke encountered them together, he would pause, allowing the animal a brief greeting before addressing her, his eyes attentive, searching for signs she could not name. With each courtesy, the danger grew. Raven's Hollow was not a sanctuary removed from society, but its very emblem. Letters arrived, visitors called, and the machinery of rank resumed its steady turning. She overheard her own existence rendered into speculation, a cousin's inquiry phrased too casually, a lady's raised brow, a silence that lingered too long. Reputation, she knew, did not require proof, only proximity. One afternoon, the Duke's sister arrived unannounced, her carriage wheels cutting sharply into the gravel. She was gracious, observant, and far too perceptive to be deceived by half-truths. Over tea, she regarded the woman with polite interest, her questions precise, her smile unyielding. The heroine answered with measured honesty, offering nothing that could be twisted, yet feeling the noose tighten with every exchange. When the Duke intervened, steering the conversation elsewhere, she saw the cost of that protection written briefly across his face. After the visit, the Duke grew quieter, his reserve sharpening rather than easing. She sensed the calculations behind his composure, the careful weighing of consequence against conscience. Once, passing in the gallery, he paused as if to speak, then inclined his head instead and continued on. The restraint in that gesture told her more than any declaration could have done. In that moment, she understood that his silence was not indifference, but discipline, and that discipline was both shield and prison. That night, sleep eluded her. The house breathed around her, timbers settling, clocks marking time she could not afford to waste. She considered the narrow path allowed to women like herself, How easily gratitude might be recast as presumption. How swiftly kindness could curdle into rumor. She loved him then, not with hope, but with resignation, understanding that affection itself could be a trespass. The realization steadied her, clarifying what duty now required. By morning, her resolve was complete. Gratitude had begun to shade into longing, and longing was a luxury she could not afford. To stay was to invite scandal. To leave was to preserve the fragile honor he had extended. She packed her few belongings with care, folding borrowed garments as though returning borrowed hours. The gloves lay last upon the bed, their presence both comfort and rebuke. Even the dog sensed the change, watching her with puzzled devotion. She lingered briefly at the window, watching mist lift from the lawns. Somewhere within the house, a clock chimed the hour, steady and indifferent. Time, she knew, belonged to those with options. She moved through the corridors one final time, memorizing the quiet elegance, the restraint etched into every arch and doorway. Raven's Hollow had given her shelter, but it had also shown her the shape of a life she could never claim without consequence. That knowledge hardened her resolve even as it deepened her grief. The house seemed to hold its breath as she passed. She sought him out before dawn, finding him in the library where the fire burned low and the shelves stood like silent witnesses. Her voice did not tremble as she spoke of necessity, of propriety, of debts she could never repay. She thanked him once more, formally this time, and placed the gloves upon the table between them, a boundary drawn in soft leather. The Duke listened without interruption. When she finished, the silence that followed felt deliberate rather than empty. He did not argue, nor did he plead. Instead, he regarded her with an expression newly unguarded, as though she had reached a truth he could not ignore. Outside, the first light crept across the frost, and in that pale interval, something irrevocable waited to be spoken, poised between duty and desire, altering both their futures forever. Silence pressed close, heavy with choice, promising consequences neither of them could yet foresee. Together, the morning light fell pale and trembling across the frost-laden gardens of Raven's Hollow, casting long, silvered shadows upon the paths where she had walked alone so often. The dog padded silently at her heels, as if sensing the weight of the day, aware that the stillness was more than the absence of sound. It was expectation, suspended, waiting. She wrapped her cloak tighter, feeling its familiar scratch against her wrists, and approached the Duke in the library where he stood behind the tall mahogany desk, his hands resting lightly upon the polished surface. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, and the scent of oak and smoke hung warm, intimate, and charged with unspoken thought. Her heart thrummed in a rhythm she could not name, neither fear nor hope entirely, but something between, an awareness that propriety might finally give way to possibility. The Duke did not rise, did not gesture. He merely regarded her as if measuring her step, her breath, her very presence against the invisible scale of honor and obligation. She had rehearsed a dozen speeches, each more humble than the last, yet now words seemed inadequate, frail instruments for the truth she carried. "I cannot remain long," she said, voice low, careful, each word precise. "The world will speak if I overstay. Your kindness, your protection, has already been more than any woman might hope to receive. I cannot ask for more." She kept her eyes upon the small dog at her feet, whose soft brown gaze lifted briefly to hers before returning to the hearth. The gesture, insignificant to another, seemed profound here, a quiet mirror of loyalty and trust she feared she could not embody. The Duke's expression softened, the slightest crease appearing between his brows, betraying the strain of thought behind a lifetime of restraint. "You have been very brave," he said, voice low, resonant, carrying the weight of both acknowledgement and caution. "It is not courage alone that preserves reputation, but careful discretion. Yet you have preserved both in equal measure." He paused, and in that pause, the distance between them contracted almost imperceptibly. "And you have shown me what duty may demand when tempered with mercy." She lifted her eyes at last, drawn by the gravity of his gaze. In the dim light, the depth of his understanding seemed almost tangible, as though the room itself acknowledged the moment. No longer merely her protector, he had become a witness to her endurance, her restraint, her dignity in the face of erasure. Words hovered, dangerous in their potential intimacy, and she struggled against the impulse to speak them, to betray herself with confession before he chose the terms of their understanding. "Your Grace," she whispered, almost reverently, "I owe you everything, and yet I am indebted in ways I cannot name. If I remain, it must be only as you see fit, never as one who might claim more than is proper." She lowered her eyes again, folding herself inward like a delicate letter, careful that no hint of longing escaped to dishonor the fragile trust she had won. The Duke moved then, quietly, decisively, closing the distance between them with steps that disturbed neither air nor hearth. His hand rested briefly upon the back of a chair, then upon the small desk where her gloves lay. His fingers lingered near them, yet did not touch, as if acknowledging both the barrier and the connection between them. "Proper," he said softly, "is not always safe, and safe is not always generous. You have risked more in asking for nothing than many would in demanding all." She felt the tension in her chest loosen slightly, the first breath in weeks that felt fully her own. It was not a triumph born of possession, nor a concession forced by circumstance, but the recognition that her presence mattered not as a transgression, but as an affirmation of worth. The dog nudged her hand, and she allowed herself a faint smile, small enough to avoid pride, yet large enough to acknowledge that she was no longer entirely invisible. The Duke turned, moving to stand closer, the firelight catching in his eyes like polished amber. "I offer you choice," he said, deliberately measured, each word a promise and a boundary intertwined. "You may leave, and the world will resume its judgment, or you may remain, and the house will protect your dignity as it has until now. The decision is yours, not mine." His phrasing was careful, honoring both her independence and the social strictures that governed them, yet it carried an undeniable invitation, a recognition of her agency, of her right to claim a place by his side without shame. She looked at him, absorbing the rare freedom of decision in a world so constrained by expectation. The walls of the library, the faint smoke from the dying embers, the subtle scent of paper and polished wood, all conspired to render the moment sacred, as though society itself had been suspended, holding its breath while two souls, weary and disciplined, weighed the merit of courage against the safety of retreat. She began, then faltered, her voice catching in the delicate space between propriety and desire. The Duke's gaze did not waver, but he inclined his head ever so slightly, as if to grant her permission to speak the truth she had withheld for fear of impropriety. "I would remain," she said finally, barely audible, yet fully, carrying in the soft syllables the entirety of her previous trials, the fear, the humility, the quiet hope that had grown like a candle in the dark. The Duke's expression softened fully now, and he allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Then it is agreed," he murmured, his tone devoid of ceremony yet laden with gravity. "You shall remain, and Ravenshollow will guard both you and your companion. Neither shall be diminished by circumstance." He gestured lightly toward the hearth, where the dog had curled upon the rug, oblivious to the weight of human considerations, and she felt an emotion surge within her, a blend of relief, gratitude, and tentative joy that threatened to spill over the careful boundaries of restraint she had maintained for so long. Yet even as warmth filled the room, the soft flutter of possibility, the careful balance of duty and mercy, she knew the path ahead would not be without trials. Society's eyes would still watch, and even within these walls, whispers of scandal or speculation might one day surface. But in that precise instant, the future seemed less a cage and more a corridor lined with light, offering direction if not certainty. The Duke's respect, measured and steady, had opened a door wider than any she had dared imagine. She bent to stroke the dog, feeling the familiar weight of loyalty and affection, and when she lifted her gaze to the Duke, she found in it not only authority but an unspoken promise that love, earned with dignity and patience, need not defy propriety to exist. In that quiet library, beneath the dying embers and the soft morning light, the world contracted to the narrow space of mutual understanding, the invisible bonds of respect, and the first tender stirrings of hope. And yet, as she settled into the cautious rhythm of her new place, a sound came from the corridor, A muted knock, almost hesitant, but deliberate. Her eyes widened, and the Duke's hand tensed imperceptibly at his side. Outside, the frost glimmered in the early sun, and the dog's ears pricked as though aware of change. The knock echoed faintly through the chamber, carrying with it a question neither of them had yet imagined. Who, and what, would arrive to challenge the fragile peace they had begun to construct?